Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about the kingdom of Aksum, Africa's forgotten empire. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The air along the high plateau is cool and thin, carrying with it the smell of wild thyme and distant rain. The sun is dropping now toward the western edge of the world, and the sky above the Horn of Africa has become a thing of extraordinary beauty, deep saffron near the horizon, bleeding upward through layers of amber and copper into a blue so rich and dark it seems almost solid, almost something you could press your palm against and feel it give, like warm cloth. The land below that sky is old. Ancient in a way that has nothing to do with ruins or records, but with the weight of the earth itself, the way the stone of the Ethiopian highlands rises and falls in long slow rhythms like the breathing of something enormous and patient, the way the acacia trees stand in silhouette against that burning sky, perfectly still, perfectly at ease in a landscape they have known since long before human memory began. Somewhere below you, in the gathering dusk, a dove is calling. And the plateau answers with silence. Tonight we walk slowly through one of the great forgotten civilizations of the ancient world, the kingdom of Aksum, which rose on this very plateau more than 2,000 years ago and became, at the height of its power, one of the four greatest kingdoms on earth. It was a place of towering stone monuments, of busy harbor towns, of merchants and priests and kings who corresponded as equals with the emperors of Rome and Persia. Its influence stretched from the Arabian Peninsula to the depths of sub-Saharan Africa, and it gave the world one of the oldest continuously practiced forms of Christianity, a written script that is still used today, and a legacy so deep it shaped the identity of an entire nation. Let the plateau welcome you. Let the cool high air settle around your shoulders. We are in no hurry tonight. There is only this ancient kingdom, and the long quiet of the evening, and the stars beginning, one by one, to appear. To understand Aksum, you must first understand the land it was born from. The Ethiopian highlands are not like other places. They rise abruptly from the surrounding lowlands, from the hot coastal plain of what is now Eritrea and Djibouti, from the arid lowlands of Sudan to the west, and they rise dramatically, steeply, as though the earth decided at some point to simply stand up. The central plateau sits at an altitude of between 6,000 and 9,000 feet above sea level, and this height changes everything. The air is cooler here than the surrounding regions, refreshed by rains that fall with more regularity than in the broiling lowlands. The soil is darker and richer. Grass grows in thick tufts between the outcrops of dark volcanic stone. Rivers run year-round in the deeper valleys, cutting gorges of startling depth into the plateau's edge. It is a land that rewards settlement, a land where you can grow grain, raise cattle, build something lasting. And the people who came here, in the centuries before the Common Era, did exactly that. The civilization that would become Aksum grew slowly, out of a mixing of peoples. The original inhabitants of the highlands, Cushitic-speaking peoples who had farmed and herded these slopes for millennia, were joined, sometime in the first millennium before the Common Era, by migrants from across the Red Sea, from the ancient kingdoms of South Arabia, in what is now Yemen. These newcomers brought with them a sophisticated tradition, their own script, their own architectural forms, their own gods. The meeting of these two cultures, the deep-rooted highland Africans and the seagoing South Arabians, produced something new, something neither was alone. A synthesis. A language, Gez, the ancient tongue that would become the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church, that drew from both traditions and then transcended them. A script. A way of building in stone. A way of imagining the divine. The earliest traces of this emerging culture appear in the highlands of Tigray, in the northern part of what is now Ethiopia, perhaps as early as the 5th or 4th century before the Common Era. By the 1st century of the Common Era, it had crystallized into something recognizable as a kingdom. The city of Aksum itself, the capital, the heart, sits at an altitude of over 7,000 feet in what is now the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, close to the present border with Eritrea. It is still there today, still inhabited, a quiet town of perhaps 50,000 people, its streets running between patches of ancient rubble and the enormous stone obelisks that remain, still standing after nearly 2,000 years, one of the most astonishing things the ancient world left behind. Imagine arriving at Aksum in, say, the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era, at the height of its power. You have come up from the coast, from the great port of Agilis on the Red Sea, a journey of several days on the trade road that climbs steadily up through the escarpment, from the heat of the shore into the cool clarity of the highlands. The road is well traveled. You have passed camel caravans heading down to the coast, laden with ivory and tortoiseshell and gold. You have passed merchants heading up with bolts of silk and glass beads from the Mediterranean world, with amphorae of wine and olive oil. And now, cresting the last ridge, you see the city spread before you in the late afternoon light. What you would have seen, what travelers in that era described with or in their accounts, was a city of some considerable size and sophistication. Multi-storied buildings of cut stone, their facades decorated with wooden timbers that protruded at regular intervals, casting long horizontal shadows in the slanted light, a style of construction so distinctive that it has a name, the Aksumite architectural tradition. Broad avenues. Markets loud with the voices of a dozen languages, Gez and Greek and Syriac and the Arabic of the traders from the other shore of the Red Sea and the Nubian of the merchants coming up from the south. At the center of the city, rising from a great ceremonial platform, the stelae, the extraordinary standing stones that are Aksum's most enduring legacy, carved from single pieces of granite quarried from the hillsides and dragged, somehow, to the city, then raised upright with techniques that still impress engineers who study them today. The largest of these standing stones was 108 feet tall, a single piece of stone, shaped to look like a great many-storied tower, with carved windows and doorways that gave the illusion of a building while being, in truth, pure monolith. It would have been, at the time of its raising, the largest single stone structure ever erected by human hands anywhere on Earth. Let the image of that stone hold you for a moment. A single piece of granite. 108 feet. Carved to look like a building, like a tower of many floors, because that is what the Aksumites built for their great ones, towers, multi-storied palaces, and monuments, reaching upward, and when they needed to mark the graves of their most important dead, they replicated those buildings in imperishable stone. The stelae were grave markers. They stood above the tombs of kings and nobles, their bases surrounded by altars where offerings were made, their heights visible from a great distance, proclaiming across the plateau and into the deep blue sky, "Here lies someone who mattered. Here lies someone whose name was spoken in palaces and harbors from Rome to Persia. Here was a king." The kings of Aksum were called Negus, a word that would eventually give rise to the title Negusa Negast, or King of Kings, a title still used in Ethiopia long after Aksum itself had faded. In the period of the kingdom's greatest power, roughly the 1st through the 7th centuries of the Common Era, these kings controlled one of the most strategically located territories on Earth. Aksum commanded the highlands immediately above the Red Sea, that narrow channel connecting the Mediterranean world to the Indian Ocean, through which passed virtually all the trade between the Roman Empire and the civilizations of India, Arabia, and East Africa. Whoever controlled the shores of the Red Sea and the hinterland behind them controlled the flow of incense and ivory and gold and silk and spice that constituted the lifeblood of ancient commerce. And Aksum controlled both shores. At its height, the kingdom's territory included not only the Ethiopian highlands but also a large portion of what is now Yemen, across the Red Sea, a remarkable feat of maritime power for a land-based highland kingdom. The port of Agilis, the great commercial gateway of the kingdom, lay on the Eritrean coast, a day's journey by sea from the Arabian shore, and it was there that the world came to Aksum. Greek and Roman merchants, Parthian traders, Arabs from the kingdoms of Hadramaut and Saba, merchants from the Nile Valley and the interior of Africa, they all passed through Agilis, buying and selling in a market that pulsed with the rhythms of monsoon and tide. The Greek traveler and merchant who wrote the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, the Periplus meaning the circumnavigation, a practical guide to the ports and peoples of the Indian Ocean world, written around the 1st century of the Common Era, described Agilis in detail and spoke of the kingdom inland with genuine respect. He noted the ivory that came down in enormous quantities from the interior. The elephant populations of the highland and lowland forests were still vast in that era, and the tortoiseshell and rhinoceros horn and hippopotamus hide and the obsidian and the gold. The gold in particular. Aksum sat at the intersection of trade routes that brought gold from the mines of what is now Sudan and western Ethiopia, and those who moved it grew rich, and those who taxed its movement grew richer still. Imagine the harbor at Agilis on a morning in the 3rd century. The sun has just cleared the mountains to the west and its light is laying itself across the water in long golden bars, and the harbor is already alive. Ships of a dozen kinds are anchored or drawn up on the shore, the large dhow-like vessels that make the crossing to Arabia, their lateen sails slack in the early calm, the smaller coastal craft that hug the African shore going north toward Egypt and south toward the Somali coast, the occasional Roman merchant vessel, recognizable by its different rig, that has made the long voyage from Egypt to trade here. On the shore, porters are moving. Bales are being stacked. Men are arguing in several languages over weights and prices. Camels are being loaded for the inland journey. And in the shade of a warehouse, a Greek-speaking merchant from Alexandria is recording the transaction of a considerable quantity of ivory with a meticulous hand, thinking of profit, thinking of home, unaware that the civilization around him is one that the world will largely forget, and that the records of this moment will be among the most important clues that future scholars use to piece it back together. What the merchants who passed through Agilis did not always grasp, or perhaps what they grasped too casually, without full comprehension, was the depth and sophistication of the culture that lay behind the port. Aksum was not merely a way station for other people's goods. It was a civilization with its own intellectual and artistic traditions, its own theology, its own literature. The Ge'ez language, written in a script derived from the ancient South Arabian alphabet but transformed into something new, a script that was an abugida, where each character represents a consonant modified by a vowel sound, like a small family of related signs, was used not only for commercial transactions but for inscriptions on the great stone stelae, for royal proclamations, and eventually for a rich literary tradition that produced, among other things, the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, a magnificent theological epic that narrated the story of the Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon, the birth of their son Menelik, and the bringing of the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. The Ge'ez script, descended from those ancient Aksumite inscriptions, is still used today as the writing system for Amharic and Tigrinya, the major languages of Ethiopia and Eritrea. The Queen of Sheba. In Ge'ez her name was Makeda. In Arabic she was Bilqis. The story of her visit to King Solomon in Jerusalem is told in the Hebrew Bible in only a few verses. She came, she was astonished, she gave gifts, she returned to her own land, but in the Ethiopian tradition, those few verses expanded over centuries into something vast and foundational. According to the Kebra Nagast, compiled in its current form in the 14th century but drawing on traditions far older, Makeda was a queen of Ethiopia, and her visit to Solomon was not merely diplomatic but personal. She was transformed by what she encountered in Jerusalem, by Solomon's wisdom and by the faith behind it, and she returned to Ethiopia carrying his child, a son who would be called Menelik. When Menelik was grown, he traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father, and Solomon recognized him and loved him, and when the young man returned to his mother's kingdom he brought with him, secretly, the Ark of the Covenant, the great chest containing the stone tablets of the law that was Israel's holiest object. And so Ethiopia became, in this tradition, the true guardian of the covenant, the true heir of the Davidic lineage. The kings of Aksum, and later of Ethiopia, would claim descent from Menelik, and through him from Solomon and David, a lineage they called the Solomonic dynasty. This is not history in the strict sense. There is no archaeological evidence for the Ark's presence in Ethiopia, and the historical Queen of Sheba remains a mystery, but it is something perhaps more important than strict history. It is mythology in the fullest and most serious sense. The story a people tells itself to explain who it is, where it came from, and what its relationship to the divine might be. And the relationship to the divine was, in Aksum, a matter of sustained and serious thought. For many centuries, the kings of Aksum worshipped the gods of the old South Arabian tradition, Maram, the god of war, patron of kings, Bea, a sea god, Mida, a god of the earth, a pantheon that mingled with indigenous African religious traditions to produce a faith deeply rooted in this specific land, this specific sky, these specific mountains. The stelae rose above graves dedicated to these gods. The kings composed inscriptions in their name. And then, in the 4th century of the Common Era, everything changed. The story of Aksum's conversion to Christianity is one of the more remarkable stories in the history of religion, and it involves a shipwreck. Sometime around the year 330, the precise date is uncertain, a merchant vessel from the eastern Mediterranean was traveling along the Red Sea coast when it put in at an East African port, perhaps Agilis, to take on water and provisions. There was trouble of some kind, accounts differ, and the details are obscured by time, and most of the passengers and crew were killed by local people. 2 survived. They were young men, brothers from the city of Tyre in what is now Lebanon, traveling in the household of a philosopher named Meropius who was making a scholarly journey to India. Their names were Frumentius and Edesius. They were taken to the royal court at Aksum, and there they stayed, rising over years into positions of considerable influence. Edesius eventually became the king's cupbearer, and Frumentius became tutor to the royal children and secretary to the king. When the old king died, it was Frumentius who helped to manage the kingdom during the minority of the new king, a child named Izana. Frumentius was a Christian. He was quiet about it at first, careful, using his position to find other Christians among the foreign merchants in Agilis, to allow them to meet and worship. But the faith grew in him and around him, and when the young king Izana came of age and took the throne, Frumentius traveled to Alexandria, then the most important center of Christian learning in the world, to request that a bishop be sent to Aksum. The Patriarch of Alexandria, Athanasius, a theologian of some fame who was himself in the middle of a bitter controversy about the nature of Christ, appointed Frumentius himself as bishop and sent him back. And so the man who had arrived in Aksum as a shipwrecked boy became the first bishop of the Ethiopian Church, known ever after by the Gez honorific Abba Saloma, Father of Peace. King Izana, in whose household he had spent much of his life, converted. The coins of the kingdom began to change, the old crescent and disc symbols of the South Arabian gods gave way to the cross. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest in the world, was born. King Izana himself is a figure who steps out of the distant past with unusual clarity, because he left behind him inscriptions. Several survive, carved in stone at Aksum, and they are remarkable documents, royal proclamations in Gez and Greek and the ancient South Arabian script, describing military campaigns, recording victories, giving thanks to the divine. The earlier inscriptions thank the old gods. The later ones give thanks to the Christian God. You can see the moment of conversion written in stone. Izana was not a gentle king. His inscriptions record campaigns of considerable violence against neighboring peoples who had raided or rebelled, and the language of conquest is frank, but there is also in these texts a note of something unexpected, a kind of personal piety, a gratitude to the divine that feels genuine rather than merely formal. He was a king in full, which meant he was both capable of great destruction and, apparently, of sincere religious feeling. He was, in other words, a human being. The world Izana ruled in the 4th century was a world in rapid transformation. The Roman Empire to the north was itself in the process of Christianizing under Constantine. The great Persian Sassanid Empire to the east was fighting Rome in a series of wars that would exhaust both powers. And Aksum was watching all of this from its high plateau and its strategic Red Sea position, navigating between great powers with what seems, in retrospect, considerable skill. Aksumite kings corresponded with Roman emperors. They sent and received ambassadors. They maintained the trade routes that both powers needed. And they built. In Aksum and across the kingdom, churches began to rise, the first great churches of Ethiopian Christianity, built in the Aksumite architectural style, with those distinctive timber-lace stone walls, with flat-top towers and interior chambers that would eventually produce the extraordinary rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved centuries later into the living stone of the highland cliffs. Let your breathing slow a little now. The evening is deepening over the plateau, and somewhere below you a fire has been lit, its smoke rising in a thin blue column that catches the last light before dissolving into the darkening air. The temperature is dropping, as it does every evening at this altitude, quickly and significantly, the cold of high places, clean and sharp, pressing in from all sides. Pull your shawl tighter. There is no rush. The stars are coming, one by one, out of the deepening blue, the same stars that Aksumite astronomers watched from this same plateau, the same stars that guided the ships in the harbor at Agilis through the dark crossing to Arabia. The sky is very old. The land is very old. Let that oldness settle around you, patient and unhurried. Daily life in Aksum was, for most people, rooted in agriculture. The highland plateau was farmed with a sophistication that astonished later travelers. Terraced hillsides caught and held the seasonal rains. Irrigation channels directed water from springs and streams into the fields, and the grain that grew in those fields was primarily teff, a tiny, iron-rich grain native to the Ethiopian highlands that would one day become, in the form of the spongy flatbread called injera, one of the defining foods of an entire civilization. Teff is a remarkable plant. It tolerates drought and altitude in ways that other grains do not. It requires minimal processing. And when fermented and cooked on a large flat clay griddle over an open fire, it produces a bread that is both food and utensil. You tear pieces of injera and use them to scoop up the stews and legumes that accompany it, a way of eating that turns every meal into something communal, something shared. In Aksumite homes, the smell of teff fermenting in clay pots, the sound of bread sizzling on the griddle, the warmth of a cooking fire in the cool highland evening, these were the rhythms of ordinary life. Cattle were everywhere. The highland breeds, compact, sturdy animals with long spreading horns, were both practical and symbolic. Practical because they pulled the ploughs and provided milk and meat and hides, symbolic because wealth, in this society as in many pastoral societies, was measured partly in the size of one's herd. Sheep and goats grazed the higher slopes. Coffee, the plant native to the Ethiopian highlands, probably first noticed and cultivated somewhere in the forests of Kaffa in the south of the country, was not yet the universal beverage it would become, but the wild coffee trees grew in the highland forests, and it seems likely that people knew and used their berries long before the formal cultivation of coffee began. The honey of the highlands was famous, Ethiopian honey, pale and powerfully aromatic from the nectar of the highland flowers, used in tej, the honey wine that was drunk at feasts and ceremonies, and the bees that made it buzzed through fields of wild herbs and flowers whose names in English have no adequate translation, whose smell was specifically and irreducibly this place, this plateau, this thin and luminous air. Water was life, and the Aksumites understood water with the precision of people for whom its absence meant catastrophe. The highland rains were reliable by the standards of the broader region, but they were also seasonal, concentrated in 2 rainy periods that alternated with long dry stretches, and managing the flow of that water, catching it when it came, storing it, directing it to the fields that needed it, required both engineering and social organization. Great cisterns were carved from the rock at Aksum and other highland towns, their smooth stone sides collecting the runoff from the seasonally drenched slopes and holding it through the dry months in the dark and the cool. Channels ran along the contour lines of the hillsides, feeding terraced fields cut into the gradient with a patience and a precision that could only have accumulated over many generations of observation and adjustment. The people who built those terraces understood their land the way you understand something you have lived with for centuries, its moods and rhythms, its generosities and its failures, the particular way it responds to care. The markets of Aksum would have been extraordinary places. Trade goods from across the known world passed through this city, not just as cargo in transit, but as objects that entered the local economy, that were given as gifts and kept as treasures and buried with their owners in the great underground tombs below the steely field. Archaeologists digging in Aksumite contexts have found glass vessels from Egypt and Syria, faience beads from the Mediterranean, silk fragments from China that traveled the long road through India and Arabia to arrive here, coins from Rome and Persia and India mixed in with the distinctive coins that Aksum minted itself. Because Aksum did mint its own coins, one of the very few African kingdoms of this era to do so. From the 3rd century onward, the kings of Aksum issued coins in gold, silver, and bronze, inscribed with royal names and images and, after the conversion, with the cross. These coins circulated along the trade routes, and finding one today in the ruins of a Red Sea port or an Indian bazaar is like finding a small message from the past: I was here. I was real. I mattered. The gold coins in particular were things of beauty. Small, barely the diameter of a fingernail, but exquisitely worked, their surfaces carrying miniature portraits of kings with elaborate crowns and holding scepters, surrounded by inscriptions in GEZ. Some were decorated with a gilded wheat motif, and some carried Christian symbols after the conversion, tiny crosses pressed into the gold with the care of people who understood that these objects would travel far and represent their kingdom to strangers. A merchant in a bazaar in Alexandria or Ctesiphon picking up an Aksumite gold coin and examining it would have understood immediately, here was a kingdom that issued its own currency, that had its own king, that participated in the same world of international commerce. Respect was accorded accordingly. Among the most celebrated objects associated with Aksum's grandeur is the great obelisk, the stele, that was carried away by Italian forces during the colonial occupation of Ethiopia in the 1930s. This was one of the ancient standing stones of the stele field, somewhat smaller than the largest of the obelisks that had already fallen in antiquity, but still a remarkable and ancient thing, and it was removed from its homeland and erected in Rome as a trophy. It stood there for decades, a stolen piece of history in a foreign city, until, after long negotiations, it was finally returned to Ethiopia in the early years of the 21st century and re-erected in the stele field at Aksum. It stands there now, back in the land it was born from, looking out over the plateau in the morning light, patient as stone is patient, patient as the mountains, indifferent to the short dramas of human politics and utterly, permanently at home. The 4th and 5th centuries were Aksum's golden age, the period of its greatest territorial extent, its greatest commercial activity, its most ambitious building. But the 6th century brought both triumph and the first hints of difficulty. The great King Caleb, known also by his Aksumite throne name Ela Atzbihar, ruled in the early 6th century and launched one of the most remarkable military campaigns in the history of the ancient world, a seaborne invasion of Arabia, across the Red Sea, in response to the persecution of Christians in the kingdom of Himyar in what is now Yemen. The king of Himyar had massacred the Christian community of the city of Najran, killed them in considerable numbers for refusing to abandon their faith, and Caleb, the Christian king of Aksum, crossed the sea with a great fleet and an army and overthrew the Himyarite king. He installed a Christian governor and ruled both shores of the Red Sea, making Aksum briefly a power of extraordinary reach. Churches were built in Arabia under Aksumite sponsorship. The cross flew over both sides of the straits. But Arabia did not remain an Aksumite possession. Caleb's chosen governor rebelled and established his own rule, and Aksum, though it retained influence, lost the territory. And in the 7th century, everything changed. In the deserts of Arabia, a new faith was emerging, Islam, the revelation brought by Muhammad to the people of the Hijaz, spreading with a speed that astonished the world. The early Muslim community, fleeing persecution in Mecca, had actually taken refuge in Aksum in the early years of the 7th century. The king of Aksum, the Negus, had received them hospitably, had listened to the new scripture being recited, had declined to hand them back to their Meccan pursuers. The Prophet Muhammad is reported in Islamic tradition to have said of Aksum, "Leave the Ethiopians in peace so long as they do not take the offensive." It was a moment of unexpected connection between the two great traditions. But as Islam expanded with extraordinary speed through Arabia and then across North Africa and into Persia and beyond, the commercial world that had sustained Aksum began to change. The Arab trading networks reorganized themselves around the new faith and the new political order. The Red Sea trade shifted. Agilis, which had been one of the great ports of the ancient world, declined. The routes that had carried goods through Aksumite territory found new channels, new middlemen. The Highland Kingdom, which had thrived for centuries on its position at the intersection of great commercial currents, found itself gradually, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly and inexorably, edged out of the center of things. The wealth diminished. The ambitious building programs slowed. The kings, in later centuries, moved their capital south and east, away from Aksum itself, looking perhaps for better agricultural land, for new economic footholds. And Aksum, once one of the four powers of the world, faded from the consciousness of those who had once traded with it and sent ambassadors to it and valued its friendship. It did not die. This is important. It did not die the way some civilizations die, suddenly, under the hammer blow of conquest or plague. It transformed. The kingdom contracted and shifted, and out of its transformation grew the medieval Ethiopian Empire, the Christian Highland Kingdom that maintained the Aksumite religious tradition, the Ge'ez language and script, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church with its rich liturgical practice and its ancient books and its distinctive theology. The Kebra Nagast was written down in its full form in this later period. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela were carved in the 12th century by a king who wanted to create a new Jerusalem in the highlands. The traditions of Aksum, the Christianity, the monarchy, the script, the music, the food, wound themselves into the identity of a people who carried them forward for another 1,000 years and more. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church that descends from Frumentius and Ezana is one of the oldest Christian churches in continuous existence. Its liturgical language is still Ge'ez, the language of Aksum, spoken in every church and monastery across Ethiopia, learned by every priest as a child. It sounds unchanged in any essential way from the sounds that rose in the first stone churches of the 4th century. The liturgy is chanted in complex, ancient melodies that tradition attributes to a 6th century saint named Yerd, who is said to have received them from 3 birds who came to him as he sat under a tree, a legend that captures something true about the music, which is indeed unearthly in its beauty, intricate and mournful and exalted all at once, unlike anything else in the world. In the dark interiors of Ethiopian churches, priests in white robes stand before icons painted in a style that continues an Aksumite tradition of mixing Byzantine influence with African aesthetics, and they beat the kabaro drums and shake the sistrum rattles, the sistrum, whose sound the ancient Aksumites would have recognized, whose sound the priests of ancient Egypt would have recognized, a link of metal and music reaching back through the deep corridors of time. The stelae still stand. The largest one that remains upright rises over 70 feet from the ground at the ancient stelae field, its carved surface furred now with pale lichen, its shadows long in the morning light. The underground tombs below it are still there, though their contents were long ago disturbed, carved chambers of granite block, corridors that descend into the hillside, the whole designed with an architectural sophistication that argues for generations of accumulated knowledge about stone and weight and the way darkness and the cool of the earth preserve what is placed within them. The kings who commissioned these monuments are long gone. Their names survive in inscriptions and in the king lists preserved by the Ethiopian Church. Most are unfamiliar to the outside world: Gadara, Aphilas, Waziba, Uzanas, Ezana, Caleb, names that would once have been recognized by merchants from Alexandria to Baghdad but that now live only in the specialized knowledge of scholars and the living memory of a people who never forgot them. There is something about the plateau in the late afternoon that clarifies the senses. The light comes at a lower angle now, pressing sideways through the air, and everything it touches becomes more fully itself, the volcanic stone darker and more textured, the grass more vividly green against it, the distant mountains layered in blues that deepen shade by shade toward the horizon. A group of gelada baboons moves slowly across a hillside a few hundred yards away, the strange, beautiful geladas of the Ethiopian highlands, with their scarlet chest patches like open wounds, like hearts worn on the outside of the body, their rumbling vocalizations carrying on the still air as they graze. They have been here far longer than Aksum. They will likely still be here long after most of what we consider permanent has changed beyond recognition. Let that thought rest gently, without weight. There is something comforting in the longevity of animals, in the way life on this plateau has simply continued, regardless of the names given to the kingdoms that rose and fell across it. Aksum was, at its height, a place where ideas from many parts of the world met and were transformed. Greek philosophy arrived with the merchants and was taken up by the educated. Jewish communities, some very ancient, some claiming descent from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, had lived in the Ethiopian highlands for centuries before the Christian era, and they remain there today, their traditions preserved in extraordinary isolation, their liturgical language again Ge'ez, their sacred text the Orit, their faith a kind of Ethiopian Judaism that maintained practices no longer found elsewhere in the Jewish world. These Beta Israel, House of Israel, communities, known in the outside world as Falasha, may represent the descendants of people who worshipped in Aksum before the Christian conversion, maintaining a faith that survived alongside and within the new religion for centuries. The religious complexity of the Highland Kingdom is one of its most fascinating dimensions, layers of tradition, one atop another, each leaving its trace in the landscape and the language and the faces of the people. The Ark of the Covenant. It is necessary to mention it, because in Ethiopia, in the tradition that flows directly from Aksum, it is not merely a legend or a theological concept. It is a present reality. In the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in the city of Aksum, the most sacred church in Ethiopia, a site of extraordinary importance to the Ethiopian Orthodox faith, there is said to be kept, behind closed doors, guarded by a single monk whose sole duty in life is to guard it and who will never leave, the original Ark of the Covenant, the chest of acacia wood overlaid with gold that held the tablets of the law given to Moses on Sinai. No outsider has ever been permitted to see what is kept there. The guardian monk will not allow it. Whether the object in that dark room is indeed the ancient Ark, or a copy, or something else entirely, is a question that scholarship cannot answer and perhaps should not need to. What matters is that a community of people has maintained, through every disruption and invasion and drought and revolution, through the long difficult centuries since Aksum's glory faded, the conviction that something holy is here, on this plateau, in this high cool air, in this city of ancient stones. And that conviction is itself a kind of treasure, irreducible and real. The night is coming on in earnest now. The last color is fading from the western sky, and the first stars are very bright, very close, the way they are at altitude, where the atmosphere is thin and the darkness between stars seems especially profound. From somewhere in the town below, a church bell is ringing, not the European kind of bell, but the Aksumite kind, a suspended stone disc struck with a mallet, producing a tone that is lower and more resonant and more ancient sounding than any bronze can manage. It rings out across the cooling plateau and is answered, after a moment, by silence. The kind of silence that comes after a sound that has been heard for a very long time. The kind of silence that is not an absence but a presence. Think for a moment about what it meant to be a traveler arriving in Aksum in the 4th century, a Greek merchant from Alexandria, say, or an Indian ship captain from the Malabar coast, or a Nubian trader from the kingdom of Meroe to the west. You would have arrived in a city that surprised you. It was not Rome. It was not Ctesiphon. It was not anything you could easily categorize. It was something unto itself, a highland African kingdom of enormous sophistication, where the people spoke a language you did not know and worshipped in ways that were just becoming Christian but were still shot through with older forms and colors. Where the food was unlike what you had eaten anywhere else, the tart sponge of the injera, the complex spicing of the stews, the honey wine served in clay cups. Where the architecture had its own grammar, its own logic, where the children in the streets had their own games and songs. And you would have thought, this place is real. Whatever I imagined Africa to be, some vague term for the South, some category of the exotic, this is not that. This is a civilization. This is a world. The tragedy of Aksum's relative obscurity in world history is partly a function of survival. The great classical texts of Greece and Rome were copied and preserved through the medieval period in European monasteries, and in the Arabic-speaking scholarly tradition, the literature of China was preserved with extraordinary care. The records of the great Islamic civilizations were maintained with diligence. But the texts of Gez, the inscriptions of the Aksumite kings, the records of the merchants of Agilis, these survived in smaller numbers, preserved mainly within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, largely inaccessible to the outside world until European scholars began to take an interest in the 19th century. The kingdom that the Periplus described, that Roman coins found on Ethiopian hillsides evidenced, that the enormous standing stones proclaimed, it was always there, in the landscape and the liturgy and the living memory of the Ethiopian people. It was the outside world that had forgotten it, not the people who had inherited it. And what was inherited is extraordinary. A script still in use after 2,000 years. A church whose liturgy is conducted in the language of ancient kings. A cuisine that has spread to tables in London and New York and Nairobi. A national identity rooted in the conviction that this highland is sacred, that this people is chosen, that the relationship between the divine and this specific piece of the African plateau is old and real and unbroken. Ethiopia is the only country in Africa that was never successfully colonized. The Italians tried twice and failed both times, and the second failure, at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, when an Ethiopian army under Emperor Menelik II defeated a European colonial force with a completeness that shocked the world, became one of the founding symbols of African resistance to colonialism. That pride, that absolute refusal to be diminished, it runs in a line directly back to the kings of Aksum, to Izana and Caleb, to the stele that reached toward the sky, to the idea, planted 2,000 years ago on this high plateau, that the people of these mountains had been touched by something sacred and were answerable to no one else. The fire in the town below has burned lower now. The geladas on the hillside have settled, their dark shapes just visible against the pale grass, their breathing deep and even. The stars have filled the sky completely, not one sky but many skies, depth behind depth, the Milky Way in this unpolluted darkness, not a smear but a structure, a landscape of its own, rivers and mountains of light laid across the blackness. The old Aksumite astronomers would have read this sky with care, using it for agriculture, for navigation, for the calculation of festival days, for the tracking of the movements that governed when to plant and when to harvest and when to pray. The sky above the highland was the same then as now, the same stars in the same patterns, their light having travelled these immense distances to fall on the same plateau, the same volcanic stone, the same dark soil that still grows teff and raises cattle and keeps its ancient faith. Let that continuity wash over you gently. Human beings in every era have stood under this sky and looked up and felt the same thing, that the universe is very large, and very old, and not indifferent so much as patient. Let your thoughts slow now, if they will. The history of Aksum, its trade routes and its kings, its stele and its churches, its conversion and its campaigns, its long slow transformation into something that still lives, let it settle around you the way the Highland cold settles, quietly, completely, finding every opening and filling it with its clean presence. You do not need to hold on to it. It will still be there in the morning, written in stone and scripture and the faces of people who carry it in their bones without knowing it. The plateau has been keeping its stories for 2,000 years. It will keep them a while longer. The dove that was calling earlier has gone silent. The night insects have taken over, a thin, persistent sound that is more texture than melody, the audio equivalent of the darkness itself. Somewhere a hyena calls, once, from a great distance, and the sound carries in the clear cold air with eerie clarity, and then there is nothing again but the wind moving gently through the acacia trees, the faint creak of a branch somewhere below, the sound of the plateau breathing. The great stele stand in the dark, as they have stood through every night for nearly 2,000 years. Through raids and fires and earthquakes and the slow grinding of centuries, they have stood. The largest among them that fell in antiquity, and lies now in enormous sections beside its ancient base, each section still bearing the carved windows and doorways of the tower it once was, the whole story of its raising and its falling written in the stone itself, patient as only stone can be patient. The others still reach upward. They do not diminish. They do not ask for anything. They simply persist, in the way that the mountains persist, in the way that the stars persist, indifferent to the short span of any single human life and utterly present to all of them at once. Let the image of those stones carry you now, if you will. Their cold grey surfaces. The pale lichen spreading across them in slow botanical silence. The darkness pressing around them, deep and soft as wool. The stars above. The plateau below. And somewhere in the earth beneath, the sealed chambers where the ancient kings were laid, and with them the things they loved, the coins and the glass vessels and the faience beads, the objects of their daily world, kept in the dark, cool and still, exactly as they were placed. Sleep is patient, too. It comes the way the darkness came this evening, not all at once but in layers, each layer softer and deeper than the last. The body settles. The muscles release their hold, one by one, like a hand slowly opening. The thoughts that were busy a moment ago, the lists and the anxieties and the small unresolved questions of the day, they are still there. But they are growing distant now, quieter, losing their urgency the way sounds lose their urgency when you move away from them down a long corridor. The plateau is very quiet. The night is very deep. Let yourself drift downward, now, into that dark and patient space, the way the Aksumite kings drifted into the cool earth of their tombs, surrounded by beautiful things, beneath the rising stones that marked their place in the world. The stars are keeping their watch. The stele are keeping their watch. The mountains, patient as they have always been, are keeping their watch. Sleep well. The plateau holds you.